Very glad you're here. The schedule for today, I will do a little short intro just to scope the problem place, and then we'll have few reviews of games that we thought would be appropriate for the evening, a demo of VR at the end, Casto from Teesside University, a little panel, and then at the end our students will do a short presentation of the current projects at Middlesex University. Right, so just to tell you who we are, there's quite a few new faces. So Cyber Salon, it's a joint research body between Siberia Cafe and Hypermedia Research Center, founded back in 1997 when we realized that internet is exciting, but it's also very disruptive and probably will cause no end of problems. So you can say that we woke up early and we covered quite a lot of difficult topics like net politics, games, digital rights, and at the moment, digital hate. So Siberia was the first internet cafe, which is actually 25 years since we started, which is amazing. But if you see the computers, they were just massive computers because it was heavily populated by gamers. And downstairs, we had this basement called Sub-Siberia, where people from Richard Bartlett Group were running the minimats. So multiplayer user dungeons and games which were already addressing what's wrong with society. So the early games, text-based games, were fantasy games because both Richard, one of the founder of MATS, and his partner were both working class guys who were just not very happy with what was happening at the university. And they were trying to create the future world that would not be class-based. And some of the early games were very much touching on the hate between the classes. So when you go back to the MATS, you can see that they are contextualized in a class conversation. But what we're talking about today is a really very specific breakdown of harmony within society. So the big explosion of hate which happened in about March 2016, which kind of had two flanks. One is anti-Eastern European focus and also Islamophobia. So when you remember what was going on in the early Brexit stages, a lot of Polish people got beaten up. One was killed, unfortunately. And all of that was by very young people, teenagers, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds. So that was a new thing because obviously football hooligans were of that age. But Brexit really brought to hate new demographics, very, very young demographics. Everybody was worried about Nigel Farage attacking Muslim community, and Daily Mail, stoking hate since 1933 was very much part of it, using words like betrayal, treason. This first slide is back from 1933, the famous enemies of the people, which Daily Mail then rerun during Brexit. So Daily Mail has formed in hardcore far-right fascism. We get blamed in technology that this is all Facebook's and YouTube fault, but we can see where the real enemies of the people are, which is Daily Mail editors. But what happened then, Joe Cox was murdered by an old person. So Thomas Alexander Mui was 52. So that was slightly different demographics and probably more to do with Daily Mail than with online because he just did not look like the guy who was on YouTube. So when we started thinking about it, what is the media breakdown between these two groups? So if you look at the average age of far-right killers, it's about 25, 27, and the incident in New Zealand, Brendan Tennant was 28. We're not quite sure what's happening in Utrecht, but they look quite young as well. So obviously the core violence and the core hate happens to fall around the sort of mid-20s, but the older people are not excluded from it. So where does it leave us in terms of the game? We're obviously looking at what this younger demographic is actually doing with themselves. You see from the spending patterns that the number of people playing games has been going up and up and up. So there is obviously an opportunity there where games are the medium where the younger community spends more time than in front of everything else. So does it mean that we could open it up and use the medium in a constructive and positive way? But I think what it needs from us is to step back a fraction. we don't often talk about hate. Hate is considered a taboo in a polite society. You very rarely hear people talking about hate. So we looked back, hate has been with us since ever. Greek myths have got plenty to say about Eris, goddess of hate. And she's always terribly sexy and very seductive and in a kind of very Greek way, very emotional. And I think that's a conversation that we can open up to games, because obviously we know love and hate being both quite irrational, but we know quite a lot about different types of love. We seem to know very little about hate. Hate has not been classified. So we started looking at, what hate comes with. So these are the children of hate in Greek myths. So hardship, pains, anarchy, and ruin. But also it's quite exciting. It could be quite sexual. It could be quite seductive. It could be quite addictive. The apple in the fairy tales comes from Greek myths. So temptation of the apple by hate, and then some horrible things happen. So unfortunately, apple was indicated in it. I don't know if the guys who used Apple for technical companies knew, but obviously there is something. The K is beginning of the Greek word for hate. So when we look at different types of hate, we also started looking different kind of media used to incite hate. And it's very recently has been linked to new technologies, because something which I didn't know about, during Nuremberg rallies, where the fascists really consolidated the power, the rallies were pioneering in the use of public announcement system, where you can really get the crowd going and roaring, and you can actually have a crowd of up to 700,000 people, where before, without the public announcement system, you could barely talk to more than 20. So the new technology, exploited unbelievably well by German propaganda, has helped to put this sense of crowd incitement together. So that didn't happen by itself. Technology has definitely played a role in getting us into direction that really rationally nobody would have gone before. So these new media have got form in creating hate and hate conducive environments. If you move to new media as we know it, Twitter, via daily stalking hate and inciting violence from ever-present Mr. Trump, slowly people started getting this sort of daily 5, 6, 7 messages of hate in their feed, so increasing the frequency of hate experience, which normally would happen to people, maybe once a year, maybe occasionally, but Twitter brought hate right into everybody's faces, making people aware of this negative energy. So unfortunately, only people who have something to say about hate are not very nice characters. So Nietzsche is the one who spent probably most time thinking about hate. You might value his philosophy, but he wasn't a nice guy for sure. But we reached to him because he spent a fair amount of time pondering on different types of hate. And when we go with the games, we're interested in not every type of hate, because we're only a small research group and we can't hack everything. But if you look at different type of hates, contempt of those with less strengths, hatred of equals, where there is a chance of a win, and fear of those with more strength. So it's kind of hate and strength are very much included. And also the hate, the most important for us today, is hate of unnatural and external thing. Hate of people who are hate-worthy, which Nietzsche talks about displacement hate, that instead of hating one person who causes you pain, you project it on the whole lot of people that the person is from. So I think this is the kind of hate that we can deal with within the game environment, because that displacement, irrational as it is an experience and a bias that we can probably hack. So this is an example of it, one of my favorite stories, where the Hungarian person who suffered during the Russian Revolution in Hungary, he lost his brother to the revolution, killed by Russian army, and then found himself as a diver, scuba diver, in somewhere in Indonesia, I think, and he finds this capsule which drops from the sky, and the capsule is a Russian cosmonaut who landed in slightly wrong place. And there is this very tense scene when the character called Tibor can see the Russian insignia and the Russian cosmonaut, but because he lost brother to the Russians in the 56 war, he plays for time and delays time until the cosmonaut runs out of air. The cosmonaut dies. But when they open the capsule, and this is the Russian cosmonaut smart girl who recorded the conversation. So then they realized that Tibor knew she was going to die and let her die. But the conclusion of the book, in a typical Arthur C. Clarke, is that, well, actually nobody likes Russians anyway, so we'll just let it go. So it's just this bizarre combination of which he picked very well, of displacement hate and the consensus changing that justifies his behavior. So these are kind of, daily hates that we can probably deal with. But the one that games approach is the hate with fear, which mostly comes from ignorance and fears of one's own insecurity, of lack of control, where we develop defensive thoughts out of ignorance. So those of us who were here in 2010 remember that Facebook wasn't a vehicle for hate. Facebook was a vehicle for salvation and for Egyptian revolution, where everybody signed up the names to support with solidarity of the murdered Egyptian. So, media possibly is neutral, and we certainly have seen media on the good and the bad side. Are games neutral? We don't know, but we like to evaluate the opportunity of how we can attack that one small part of hate which comes from ignorance and lack of understanding of others. So today we're going to look at a few different examples where the games are trying to explore the words of the other and how the richness of the games can transport us in an emotional way to the reality of the other.
This is an interesting choice for us to take on because it, as you can see, it's already very well known, considerably well-recognized award-winning game from nearly 4 years ago now. The BAFTA announcements for their final list came out 2 or 3 days ago, so at the end of last week. So, the games that are currently in this Games for Good category, which is growing, it's more and more well-defined that there is this games beyond entertainment, I think is what BAFTA is calling it this year. And they are exploring deeper social causes and a series of narratives of interaction and interactivity that sort of step beyond, beating, winning. And this game does that as well. But as I say, being that bit older, why did I want to bring it back up? Actually, partly because it's a great game. It's worth talking about its story. It's worth talking about how it was developed, because we are talking about how can content get developed. So I'll take a moment to talk there. But also there is a subplot, let's say, to the story of the game, which is the community in which Nuna, the little girl there that you play as primarily, lives. And no surprise, if you're an Inupiaq Alaskan native, then your village, your community probably matters to you a little bit more than it does if you're living in a city with, slightly less harsh environment, slightly fewer polar bears trying to eat you, slightly fewer things that can do you damage in a day. The idea of being lonely in a city of very many millions is something that we recognize. This is part of our individualism. But it's the history of this game and how it was developed. So the common thread really is that Never Alone is an artifact of cultural heritage. From that perspective, there's the telling of the other in a story that you might not have otherwise heard. There's really two pieces to that story. One is this one tale, Kanuksukaya, which is the long narrative to the game, of which maybe 2 or 3 other small stories interplay. But the research was a body of 20 or 30, a mixture of elders, a mixture of storytellers, and the games devs literally sat down with them over a series of months and said, okay, tell me more and more about your history, tell me more and more about this. And it was an interactive discovery. So rather than someone sit down and say, okay, we need to build a game where you survive polar bears and work out what causes the blizzard, we sat down and said, okay, we want to produce a vehicle to preserve cultural history. We want to produce a vehicle that can communicate this cultural history into groups that don't know about it, that haven't heard about it, and that can then find out about it. The game they came up with is fairly simple to play, but very engaging, and I will play a little bit of it. It's a platform puzzle-solving game, so you move around either with a second player, so you can co-play it with someone on the couch. One of you plays as Nuna, somebody else can play as the fox. Or if it's just you on your own, you can toggle between the two characters. Obviously, there are some things the fox can do that Nuna can't, and vice versa, and learning how that plays out as part of the gameplay mechanic. why this came back in this conversation like 3 or 4 years after it first came out, why it's worth touching over, is because it directly addresses the dismantling of community. And it's addressing it partly because, there are circumstances around the Inupiaq that are changing their environment. They are changing their social activity and their social history. So their community is being dismantled in part from without, but also, again, from within. I always remember the tale of, when you're learning in a school playground, why it's not nice to be nasty to someone. You learn that because you see them there and you see their reaction to when you do a nasty thing. And you feel that nasty thing, oh, that's not very good. But where you carry out that action mediated by a screen or a device of some sort, all you get is the little adrenaline thrill that you've done something wrong. You never see the impact of it. So the proximity of the reality of your effects, I think, makes a big difference. So for me, storytelling about community is a really powerful way to actually break down that sense of it's only about me, it is my competition. I can fight this and I'm in charge of running this game. It's like, no, the value has always been the community. It's a mistake to assume that it was only ever you. There's always been the group around you. You got to where you were because of the group around you. And, the Inupiaq tale is, nobody survives the winter unless there's the group around you. Okay? So it's a co-op single-player puzzle platformer. Her journey weaves this series of traditional stories around this main tale being a well-known, well-recorded tale about the blizzard. And as you go about this singular journey, I say there are these little bonuses that you can find in the form of mini documentaries, so mini cultural artifacts. Okay, so just play 1 or 2 of these, because they are actually worth hearing.
My brother was out seal hunting. He got attacked from behind and managed to grab his knife and save himself. When he came to realize, oh no, it's a mother. We've always known traditionally that we avoid killing a mother. It's always been sacred to us to protect them. He had to present himself to the council, and so he was given the job to mother the baby, and we kept it. It got so big, it went over the barricade one day and got to the dog food, and that was an indication that, brother better go teach it how to survive on its own. So he did. I really got attached to the bear because I more or less grew up with it. And some days when brother took him walking, once in a great while he'd put me on the bear and I would ride on it like a horse. I was just happiest little girl in the world.
Niveaksiagarualup kangersingarup supaya ikayoktikaqane bilugit. Allawlun itam nanteriganniaq niveaksiagarualup kangersingarup supaya ikayoktikaqane bilugit. Allawlun itam nanteriganniaq Sivuneksipkangaga niveaksiagarualuk kanutun pekpaganaktilaangit tamatkua ikayoktaruat.
Really great crossover in terms of both being, an educational piece as well as an emotionally engaging piece, as well as being an entertainment Okay, so 24 little documentary films. As I say, as you move through, you'll see these little owls in different places. You just hear them, and you're like, okay, I'm going to drop off the main gameplay here and go and find that owl because I want to hear more sort of stories. There are 40-odd different cultural ambassadors, different storytellers from the community. The elders of the community all contributed to the game's development. This particular youth leader was one of those contributors, and he speaks of what it felt like to see the game's devs come back with this artifact, this educational tool. How much richer the understanding of his heritage will be to the next generation because this thing exists. I was like, okay, that's a very valid point. How many more times can we have that in games? How many more stories could we tell?
The recurring type of character in Inupiaq stories is the manslayer. And the manslayer is kind of this bad guy. And I think really what's at risk when the manslayer comes into story is the livelihood of individuals and the whole community. And so the manslayer is really used as a way to say, don't act only for yourself, always hold the community in your heart. Oftentimes in these stories, there is one person that will stand up.
And what this humble person will represent, who faces that manslayer, is a return to order, a return to true living in the community. And it just takes that one person. It could just be that one person that can help to change everything. Because everyone wants to live a good life. Everyone wants to have a good community.
And so that character turns up throughout the game. More importantly, as I start reading around this, that character is a mythic element beyond this game, beyond this story, in other versions of that story, that there's always a reason to talk about the community. That you don't survive the winter without it. But then perhaps what we need are good examples of community, good reasons to tell community stories outside of that. So that is it, Never Alone. I am not alone. Actually, Kisime, my translation is awful. Ichuana is the I am not alone. For me, I think it's charming. It can be inspirational. I love the mix of documentary content versus gameplay. That's a really interesting piece to go for. It's now available on literally everything. Buy it for your phone, buy it for your computer, buy it for your game station. It really was one of the first things that BAFTA used to start carving out this gaming beyond entertainment sort of space. And I think you can probably see why. So there it is. That's Never Alone. Fairly simple gaming mechanic that's been around forever, put to an entirely unique, I think, sort of twist and new use. Hopefully you see some value in that. Thank you.
I want to talk about the stories games can tell, but first I want to invert the question and I want to ask, what is a story about games? On a given day, this is the game news stories according to Google. I wouldn't say this is super comprehensive or anything, but it's not really that surprising. This has been my experience. So we have some promotion here. We have a PewDiePie, somebody who streams video games for a living. He plays them online and he shows them to others, being shouted out by the person who shut up New Zealand, the church strategy. I ignored my children to play video games. Liverpool is scared of losing fans to Fortnite, and the Division 2 is severing politics from video games. So in summary, it's not a very positive picture. It's one of disconnect, violence, just sort of losing track of reality, not really representing it very well. So let's talk about the stories those kind of games tell, right? So a random smattering of the most popular games at the moment, it's Fortnite, Rocket League, Rainbow Six, Far Cry 5, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, Call of Duty, Black Ops 4, and Red Dead Redemption 2. Fortnite doesn't appear because of different metrics, but it doesn't matter. Basically, Fortnite and Rocket League, they sit in a sort of a self-expression mode of game. Like, there's not so much a story as such. They're just a big online community, and most of the, like, how it looks and a little bit of the flavoring is about self-expression. So you can buy hats and outfits to express yourself in a social space. Then Rainbow Six, Battlegrounds, and Call of Duty, but also Far Cry are all some kind of variations on a very strong military theme where you shoot people in military gear. The exception here being Red Dead Redemption 2, which is a game about being a cowboy, which is fitted in the Old West and does a lot of nice historical research, and is the only game in this list that's actually praised for its story, but it does so in a rather predictable way where you are a cowboy shooting people. Again, there's a through line here. It's not all violence, but there's almost nothing here that really tells a story and certainly doesn't tell it non-violently. It's also notable that most of these games can also succeed without telling a good story. It's not really about telling a good story. It's nice, but it's more about like how does it feel when you shoot somebody, right? So what stories could games tell, right? So this is what they tell in popular perception. What could they tell instead? This is slightly disingenuous. Maybe in popular perception, like it's like, ooh, maybe they could do something different. The fact is they already are doing something different. The means of production around games have been hugely democratized since, I don't know, give or take 10, 15 years ago, when for various sort of technical reasons it became much more viable to do small-scale game production. With small-scale production came the ability to serve niches and to tell different stories because you don't have to spend all your money marketing the hell out of your game, so the risk is lower. That opens up the space to do other things, maybe things that are not about shooting other people in the face. Where the Water Tastes Like Wine fits in here nicely. So it is a game like Red Dead 2 is also set in the Old West, but more around the Dust Bowl era, like the 1930s. And while the game certainly features violence, it's never with you as the instigator. It's more about the stories behind it. So what are the inspirations for this game? The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck and other books about oral history around the 1930s. Beat poets like Kerouac and Ginsberg. The art style was drawn from classic wood carvings like this one from Emil Nold, and my personal favorite movies such as The Beautiful Days of Heaven, which talks about that era. So already we have like quite a bit of a difference, right? Most popular genres, they either represent some kind of hyper-capitalist mode of consumption where you can buy and show off through consuming things. You can express yourself, such as in Fortnite and other sort of social games of that nature, or through explosions and violence. Here we have some like poetry and some certainly not like unpopular cultural artifacts, but certainly unusual, at least in contrast to how games are popularly perceived. It is a game about stories. It's about finding vignettes of stories across America in an almost anthropological sense. You find very short snippets of story that have been made up, but that represent some kind of truth about 1930s America. As you can see, it starts out with a very classic scene in which you are sold out to this devil character. You lose a poker hand to him, and then you die, and you're indebted, obviously. And he makes you seek out stories, right? And it starts off with, we want you to find the small stories, the big stories mostly lie. So we want you to do this kind of research, and that's also you as a player. So most of the game is spent exploring the big American landscape and finding stories such as this one. You walk into a town and you see a house and somebody tells you that the house is haunted, but there's a twist. Well, it's actually not haunted. It's somebody curses it because it's made by their former student, and they're both architects and they stole business from each other, and this is rivalry. And that feels as a betrayal because they used to work together. So this is a kind of a mundane story, and you put it in your pocket and you carry it with you. And then as you traverse through the game, what starts to happen is you meet people like this one that will retell that story back to you, except now they're feuding architects, and they come to a fight. And it gets blown out of proportion, and the more you travel, the more you hear more stories told back to you in an ever-increasing levels of majesty and fiction. The game is here demonstrating how mundane truths get twisted to serve some entertainment and story need. But at the root of it is some kind of truth. Again, telling us something about how stories and myth-making operate. In a way, the game is trying to reverse the big myth about society and make it about small stories. This is sort of the premise on which it operates. So it is a patchwork of stories that you discover, all these small myths and truths, but also itself, in the way it was actually made, the creator actually commissioned a lot of stories from different people. So there are all these characters that are authored. So here we can see Mary Landgrab, that's an actual person who wrote this story for the game. So in a holistic fashion, the game gives space to other writers to bring a little bit of their truth into the sort of the tapestry of stories it's trying to represent. Now, in these encounters, you meet people and they want you to tell you stories. So here you will have all your collected stories, which are arranged by some kind of tarot logic and themes, and you have to tell them the stories they want to hear in order for them to tell you their life story. You fulfill a need for these people, and there's an exchange. In some ways underlining our need for stories and engaging with that, but also pointing out slightly darkly, I guess, the sort of instrumentation and the transactional value of stories. You know, not just for good, but also for evil, and this is trying to sort of expose that to us. So, in the end, it's a game that posits that we can get closer to each other, but also closer to reality by listening to each other's mundane stories, and it tries to show you that by confronting you with these small stories about the West and see how they change. Its premise is sort of neatly lined up here in the quote from The Wolf, which is funnily voiced by Sting for whatever reason. So the more true stories you can find and tell, the more you can weave the truth into the big story. Tarnish it a bit, perhaps, but isn't a dingy and battered truth better than a shining lie? So its thesis is we get closer to these small truths and maybe we get closer to the bigger truth. Well, you could argue that point, you know, you could debate it or discuss it or disagree with it. Certainly this game tries to do something beyond just having good trigger feel, right? Or, you know, a sense of triumph of having had victory over many of your friends or anonymous online strangers. It actually tries to work with this thesis and bring some sense of closeness. And I think that's admirable. If you want, this game is also available out on Steam. Please actually buy it. It was unfortunately not that financially successful, sadly, as some of these things are. It's a slow game, but it's very well written. I can heartily recommend it.
Thank you very much. Great.
So thank you very much, Eva. I've indeed had the pleasure to play test and review On the Surface for you today. On the Surface is a game that deals with social cohesion and what we call in sociology the social bond. The game is about a group of 5 teenagers, and it's a text-based game. And by our actions and answers, we drive the story and decide whether the group will fall apart or not fall apart. But I haven't finished the game yet. I've been playing it for 8 days, so it takes quite a while to get through it, but it's very enjoyable, and I will give some details and show you some stills in a moment. Before I go there, there's also a hashtag. The game is from the challenge and funded by the Institute of Strategic Development. Thank you very much, with support from google.com, and was developed by Digital Liberties and Cohere Partners. And I believe that someone from Challenge is here. Hello, and is there also someone from the Challenge and Cohesion partners? So maybe we'll have a chance to catch up later on. For me, it was really super interesting because I'm dealing with this issue nearly on a daily basis, because as a program leader, I'm dealing with all of the issues that might arise when students are dealing with group work. So it happens very often that groups of 4 or 5 people suddenly start to disintegrate. So I was really interested in testing the game and looking at how the narrative manages to actually drive the plot. Well, before I get there, I just wanted to share a story from my own student years. And this story has indeed to do with the social bond as well. So I remember I studied for a research degree in philosophy back then. And I remember my first year of study, I came across a term that I couldn't look up anywhere. It was literally impossible. I had, of course, study skills, library skills developed. There was still no internet yet back then. Then I start to approach the student learning assistants. I was like, do you know what vinculum substantiale means? And everyone was just looking at me with this phrase. There was just absolutely no way of working out what was actually meant. And in the end, we actually found out that none of the students in the seminar, including the student learning assistants, could actually give a definition. I remember entering the room with my professor, and before the exam started, I said, may I just ask, because we just couldn't work out this one term, could you just please answer this one question, what vinculum substantiale means? And suddenly everyone started to laugh, because it actually turned out that no one knew what it meant. And he replied, well, it is the Latin term for the social bond. So what we students all had in common was that we all didn't understand what our professor was talking about. And this taught us 2 things. Firstly, it's always important to ask and speak to your professor first, but it also told us all a lesson what it means to all be in the same boat. So for me, the lesson I took out of it was, of course, to ask and to approach our lecturers. And this strange episode, it formed us into a group, and this group existed until we all had graduated. Back to the surface, back to the game. In the surface, your choices decide the future of a group of friends. There are 5 friends and 3 supporting characters. Each of these casts represents a particular character, a particular type, and the goal of the game is, of course, to work out who your friends really are. Yes, it's available via Google and the Apple stores. Meet a group of 5 friends who, like all of us, each have a public and a private side. And the way this idea is embedded in the game mechanics is the story space is a messaging application with a group chat and private chats with each of the different group members. So it's a very accurate way of representing the difference between private and public. So in a way, the medium embeds itself in the message, really, here. But what happens when pressure is on? Can they keep up the divide between the person they show the world and the person they really are? These are two screenshots from a private chat with Jesse. And here the conversation revolves all around everyday experiences with racism. So this becomes a topic in the group chat, and then Jesse, one of the characters, approaches me directly and asks me for my opinion whether the UK is racist or not. And at the end of each sequence, the player is then offered a binary choice. And this is what drives the plot forward. So here it's really all about Jesse's experience with everyday racism as an example. But what happens when we find out things that make you question if you really know them? So this is another screenshot from the group chat. And here it's really all about leaving the virtual space. So it's really about this moment of transgression and meeting for dinner in town. And one of the group members has a crush on another one, and all sorts of confusion arises from that. Because this person is cheeky and tries all sorts of ways of sniffing out whether his object of interest likes him or not. In order to impress the girl, our friend then starts to make inappropriate jokes. We can again decide on which side we want to be here, but we are then also being approached by our friend directly. So it's not just sorted by turning these advances down, but he also then approaches me directly and tries to hear me out with what I might think. And this is, I think, where the game literally started to turn into this little micro drama in my pocket. This is the first time when I seriously realized how engaged I actually am, because here I'm being approached directly, and it's indeed this little micro drama that suddenly unfolds in my pocket. I've, by the way, also asked my students to play the game and chip in with comments, so I have no resume for you, but I've brought my students and they have played it as well, so they'll probably be able to give you their opinion as well, and then we can sort of, find out what we can actually say about it beyond the fact that we liked it. So one of the texts that we have been looking at in class was Gamification and Governmentality by Niklas Schrape, which deals exactly with the idea of how can we actually use gamification to embed values in the subject in a very Foucaultian sense. So how can actually the game help turn the world in a sort of a positive panopticon? And of course, this is one of the questions I've been asking myself also in relation to knife crimes. Could we think of games that tackle the problem of knife crime as well? But back to the surface. So here in this sequence, our friend, he's basically the antagonist and sort of tries to deceive us and tries to test us and test our ethics. So in order to get the girl, he then apologizes to everyone, copies and pastes the same message into every private chat, and this comes out. How do you actually respond to these rather embarrassing issues? And here it's already the party, that's the subject. Here we have sort of arrived at this moment of transgression, and here it really decides whether who wants to hang out with whom and who doesn't. So Tanya is his object of desire, and you can see, I don't want to give any spoilers, but it doesn't look so good for him. And this is already my resume. I have not provided a sort of polished summary, a polished conclusion, because this is what I wanted to bring out in the discussion with my students. So thank you very much for now.
So Casto came all the way from Teesside, so yay! Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I wanted to go ahead and thank you, Benny, for the actual awesome little talk you did there on Never Alone. It's very much the inspiration for the work we're doing at Teesside University. I am fortunate enough to teach one of the premier game art programs in the UK, or so the administration forces me to tell everyone. And our students are remarkably talented. And what we're doing currently is working on a VR project to create a visualization, which probably will be evolved into an actual game concept based on the cultural heritage of the South American people of the Andes. And what we're doing is working in collaboration with archaeologists, stakeholder communities, the government itself, to actually create a visualization based on not only the extant archaeology, but also the rich cultural heritage of their folklore and tales. Right now, we're focusing most of our work on the side of Tiwanaku and the Bolivian highlands and whatnot. And we're doing a reconstruction based not only on the archaeological remains, but also on the folklore which has surrounded that area. Currently, the actual site is not fully excavated. It hasn't been fully explored. And so we're hoping engagements like this will arouse people's curiosity in it. We're working with archaeologists over in Finland and Belgium, the United States, of course, and also South America, taking their artifacts and doing reconstructions, visualizations of them within VR. Here are some ceramics from the actual site of Priti in Lake Titicaca. That's the famous foot vessel, which everyone seems to like, including myself. But our students are using this work to create engaging visuals. We're using technology such as Unreal Engine and current production pipelines that game industries use to create these little snippets of life which existed back in the 800s to 1100 AD, as well as part of the residential areas, looking at artifacts which have been remained and reconstructed and investigated by archaeologists and anthropologists, and also rebuilding the sites themselves based on people's research and whatnot. This is the Bennett monolith, which is 9 meters high, actually, with an Asucan quartz right next to the Akapana pyramid. And that's the Akapana pyramid itself. We're primarily focusing on visualizations, but we will be going over into narrative exploration, seeing how these things impact people. We want to engage with people on the level of Never Alone, also as games such as What Became of Edith Finch, which has a rich narrative background, exploring not only cultural ties, but also family ties and whatnot. And so we're basing the idea of having, and this is actual environment which the actual students worked on. I'm very proud of them and whatnot. We've used the research to rebuild these ceramics, do visualizations and concepts, and enabled us to actually view this in real time in actual virtual reality. But the idea is that we will be able to explore the site via an archaeologist's lounge, to study, and engage with the culture, the material culture, and also the cultural folklore and whatnot. But this is something which actually the students are remarkably engaged with, both in terms of what the visuals are being presented as, but also in terms of how we're interacting with the actual academics out there. We recently traveled to Berkeley, over to the US. These are some samples of using the iconography of the Andes to do little creatures and ceramics and whatnot. This is them going a little crazy with the actual motifs. But we actually went over to Institute of Andean Studies, their conference in Berkeley, and presented this to the actual archaeologists, and they were having quite a unique experience with them. Not only showing the actual world, but discussing their research and how that can be embedded within our actual worlds. That's Donna Nash. She has quite a reputation in the community. One of our lead artists, Emily, and that's the team right there. I find it remarkably supportive of the university to actually help us with engaging within the community itself. That's it. Cool. Cool. Thank you. Thank you.
Simon, what was your emotional sense of engagement with that game? How much was it microdrama in your pocket or not?
I didn't really experience it as microdrama, I guess. No, I mean, I think they were just like vignettes, like that you experience, and they had some emotional resonance, but I think actually, I think they were kind of touching in how mundane they were, actually, rather than being wrapped up into drama. And I think that was kind of the part of the theme of the game as well. It's like we love the drama of the myth, the grand sweeping arcs, but the game actually tries to engage with the sort of mundane underpinnings of it. And I think that was actually its strength.
So contrasting approaches to sharing the reality of the other. And so what about your thinking about how much detail, how much concrete you think we need in games to really get the feel for what that other life can be?
Right, I think that's a kind of an interesting question, sort of like chasing the perfection of what the actual cultural artifact looks like. I think that should be less important as to the story behind the actual artifact. We can also try to have accuracy as much as we want. We can do digital scans, we can tweak the artwork, but if we're not telling the story behind that physical element, I think it shouldn't supplant that, right? I think the actual cultural heritage behind the actual artifact, the physical being, should be first as opposed to second.
So story first, but no harm in putting some details behind.
Sure. Yeah.
Right, because on the surface, it's really on the extreme end of it. There is really relatively sparse graphic and relatively sparse visual, but the text does a lot of heavy lifting.
Well, I think on the surface really turns social media into the game engine, and of course draws on its sort of contagious potential. By which I mean that it is really very difficult not to look up the phone all of the time, because I think one of the criticisms that I read in the reviews was that there were a couple of people pointing out that what they would miss is actually the notifications. And I actually think it's not a bug, it's a feature that on the surface doesn't send notifications directly, because it is so engaging, just by means of the story and by means of the medium. And I also completely agree with what you pointed out, Eva, in your introduction. So you sort of made the connection between mass mobilization and the 30s. And one of my theories is indeed that social media is not properly understood, or cannot be properly understood by our generation or our generations yet, very much in a sense in which radio has not been understood in the 30s. Because what's completely underestimated is this enormous amplification that takes place. So it's not only the transportation and the globalization of communication, but it's this massive amplification. So very much like radio, but also the loudspeaker in public space used to represent, especially in the Eastern Bloc and the Warsaw Pact states, the voice of God, in a sense that it was a speaker above our heads, and in one way or the other, subconsciously, people associated with the voice of what Freud called the superego. It reminds me of a project I was involved in a couple of years ago in Krasnoyarsk. It was a summer school dedicated to the creation of art in public space in Krasnoyarsk. And the whole project was basically a reaction towards the mayor's plan to turn the public loudspeakers on the main boulevard into a 24/7 street radio, where you would, instead of listening to Tchaikovsky and the party news, have to listen to jazz. And it was not sufficiently understood that this particular medium form, has basically has lost its legitimacy. For a wide population, for vast, for the vast amount of population, because it's been associated with the Über-Ich, the super-ego in the Soviet era, which was the party line.
So I think that's where we'll turn the conversation to you. So do you think there is a way of inoculating your generation and the upcoming generations against hate that is being stoked by Daily Mail or public announcement systems or Twitter through the medium of gaming? John?
So three quick points. One is Steve Bannon built the entire Trump empire on Warcraft, World of Warcraft, and his observations around how communities operate and guilds operate within Warcraft. Ask him. He wrote a whole thing about it, right? Which I think is actually remarkably important. Right? As somebody with part of that statement. Two, the challenge with actually generating games which actually have social good in mind, like the ones that are there, is distribution. How are you actually going to get people to see these things, or actually and engage them to do it? It's easy to find patrons, someone who might pay for them. And Never Alone was one of the rare games that actually got critical success. The vast majority of them are living in the bottom seat, right? Never to be seen. There's like the one Simon was talking about, which is awesome. Right? And third is that actually, I do think the big question is still, how do we work within what is now a social gaming environment, whether it is a Fortnite environment or a Warcraft role, or an Anthem Legends, or any of the newer environments where you have many kids playing together, and actually trying to sort of anti-troll, to actually encourage that. Because a lot of these games, Fortnite especially, is a game where you literally kill everybody until you're the last one standing. And it's the most social game that I've ever seen, right? Everybody's really happy. Like, everybody's always laughing throughout it. It never feels like you're going to assassinate people. The whole idea is the only way to succeed is to actually work together, as opposed to just kill each other. So there is a movement towards that, which I'm into killing things, but actually I was more into the guild nature of Warcraft than I was into the game. And the Call of Duty stuff and the esports side has actually completely gone 180 degrees, and that is now community-led as opposed to just teaching fuckwits going and killing people in mosques, right? How to shoot people. It's a lot of that stuff.
No, I think it's a very good point, and that's why we were looking at the specific sub-hate, if you can use the taxonomy, because we initially looked at the knife culture and, do games have anything to add on that, because we touched by it so closely. But when we actually asked around people who work with the knife crime environment, they said, it's not really a hate thing, it's a business, which really shocked me. But I said, this is more like killings in New York in trenches, which was why we picked like where the water tastes like wine, where there isn't really much hate going on. It's just a fight for the territory, and yes, they're not loving each other, but it's not a cold hate. It's business, and I think that's probably where we can't really explore much, because it's a separate issue, and it's not a hate thing. So we were more looking at hate of the other, particularly hate of the less equal, hate of contempt, hate of the unknown. Is the
if what we were looking at was the problem of working against entropy, that is, if a slide towards hatred were part of a slide towards chaos, and we did not expect interaction, then there is no enemy in this. And trying to move people away from hatred would mean fighting a battle without an opponent, except entropy, which of course always wins in the end, but that's not necessarily relevant. If you're trying to fight hatred, and if there are people, as we now know there are, whose aim is trying to foster hatred for whatever end, then we're entering into an interactive system. That is, we're entering into combat, and gamers, I think, will particularly understand the idea of combat as an interactive system. We're entering into an interactive system in which one cannot just say, I'm going to introduce the following set of games that are going to increase community cohesion. We must also envision what the response to that is, and we must start to think, again, in a gamer-relevant way, we must start to think a number of moves ahead in order to ensure that we are not easily outplayed. That is, we who would come here to a Games for Good event are not outplayed by people down the street at the Games for Evil event who are seeking to foment hatred, who are quite possibly thinking more than one move ahead. So the question I've got, once we get past the idea of creating a game, once we get past the idea of uptake of the game, how does one create an environment in which the gamer for good or gamers for good are able to successfully, continuously prosecute combat and succeed? Easy question, of course.
Very good question. I think this is probably Simon's question.
So it's interesting that you frame the question in such combative terms, because I think that's the kind of thing that we're trying to sidestep in a way. I would say that that if you look at like how online communities operate around games, there is the element of toxicity that exists especially strongly in very competitive 1-versus-1 games, or like winner-takes-all games, but also in very tightly wound team games where each person has to represent a role really narrowly and really to a very high degree, and as that person doesn't do it, the whole team fails. And those games, like League of Legends and any number of other games, they feature a high level of toxicity. The bigger conversation is that these games will engender an idea that there is a width and a breadth of criticism and appreciation, and that we will start to question the innate quality of games.
And I guess it's also phrasing what's combat. Do we take it literally or not literally? Because part of Casto work, I really quite liked. It was quite fascinating by the approach, because obviously Latin American, South American cultures are awfully old and have an awful lot of history behind them, and they're fighting at the moment with the sort of very shallow McDonald's culture of North America. And it really is probably the right level of conversation when you fight McDonald's with culture which has got about 5,000 years. And I think this is probably rephrasing it slightly. I think absolutely the right question, and one that we have to ponder, but maybe also taking it somewhere else. I have noticed because I've got teenagers as well, they are Fortnite players, all of them, and I've noticed the boys play as girls. And I couldn't quite figure out why, until I figured out, right, okay, because they like the surprise element. Because if you come into the game as a sort of, teenage-looking, long hair something, then you might create this element of surprise. But I said, no, I don't do that. I just like playing as a girl. So and then I realized, actually, there's a lot of girls in these scenes. More and more avatars are female. No idea what it means, but it's very interesting. Because then, the idea of a battle and the game between genders, virtual genders, away from real genders, it's an exposure to something different. which might be a good or bad thing. I haven't quite concluded, but it's different than us when we were playing.
But that was
like I would play
what,
as a guy, I would never play as a girl.
But that's actually what Richard Bartle had in mind when he founded Mudd all those years ago, was that people could go online and explore different identities and different aspects of themselves. So it sounds to me actually like going back to the original idea of exploring different sides of yourself and playing different roles.
The question is this really the process that's going on here? Or is it not just, the simple, the simple phenomenon of transportation? When I read Tolstoy's Anna Karenina or play Lara Croft, it doesn't necessarily mean that I want to explore different sides of myself.
But you are exploring whether you like it or not.
You are exploring a different side of yourself through the way people treat you, and people do treat people differently when depending on what they perceive their gender to be. It's very well established.
I think that's really I think that's really the first step when you actually start engaging with the medium, as whether it's another gender, whether it's you're binary or whatnot, or whether the culture itself. It definitely isn't a solution to societal ills or whatnot. And the question that was posed, how do you combat these things? I think. And I regret to say this, or I probably will regret to say this, that you can't really combat it head on. You do it in very small steps. You do it through constant evolution, which I think is what you commented on, that this generation we have, which is currently experiencing with social media and technology and whatnot, people from our generation, I really hate to say this, right? Like I'm closer to her generation than the younger people here, even though it just seemed like yesterday I was sitting where you were. We can't really engage with it the same way that you are. However, I think we have an appreciation for where it could lead to. Now, the thing which I'd like to go ahead and get across is that it seems that everyone wants instant social justice. Everyone wants instant gender equality. And because of this, you have this conflict between those people who perhaps would have been swayed on a more gradual basis, and you titrate that social justice, you titrate that equality. But because it's all instant, you want to go ahead and post something on Facebook and cure the ills of the world. And because because we're not willing to wait for the gradual evolution of our culture to catch up with our expectations, I think we see a lot of the malevolence we see in the world, specifically in technology and social media.
I think we come back to, there was a question at the back.
Yeah, I was just going to say, do you think the hardware or devices that games are being played on affects the empathy and games for good? Because I was just thinking, say with the On the Surface game, which is for mobile, so do we think there's a difference between games that are designed for, say, tablets and mobile are different from games designed for consoles and PC, or not, or even VR as well? So I was just wondering what kind of impact the hardware has on kind of empathy in games for good.
So is the medium is the message, yes?
For me, actually, we're talking about, especially VR, the popular discourse is about empathy and how it can bring you closer to people. I actually take slight issue with that, because I would say that actually what we're going towards is an increasingly more private experience, right? We go from a TV and a console to a PC and a laptop to a phone to actually something that's strapped to my head. And while I can certainly interact socially with people online, it doesn't feel particularly social. So what I would be excited about is the idea of what can we do to bring games into physical space, because physical manifestation makes it automatically more social.
On the positive note, I think we explored various aspects of meeting the other in virtuality, and I think this is a beginning of a very long but interesting journey. So on that point, I wanted to thank you very much, the panel, and thank you for your reviews and taking time to comment on some quite difficult games. We're going to stay here to give feedback to our students with a short presentation, but help yourself to beer. There is a VR presentation experience from Casto Vocal, and to stay on and meet network and maybe put some projects together. But thank you very much. Thank you.